Hello, everybody. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for the PHRF Grand Round series, Clinical Research Presentations. Just a few housekeeping points that I'd like to make before we get started. We will be recording this and we will archive it on our foundation website under the events and programs section. You can see the link there. We will have Q&A after each presentation, so please feel free to unmute at those times and type your questions into the chat room. Please sign in for the attendance to claim any kind of CME or CE through the EEDS text messaging method or website portal you're using to sign in. After completion of sign-in and evaluation, you will receive a certificate. Please complete evaluation surveys that will be sent to you post-program, which is required to get your CE and provides us great feedback. One more thing, I need to, if you're here for CEs, the New York Medical College has designated this as a live credit for a maximum of 0.5 credits. The activity sign-in code is 33PROW and it expires tomorrow at noon. So make sure you sign in to eeds.com. or 828-295-1144. Dr. Khambhati and Dr. Oliva have no relevant financial relationships to report in the last 12 months with a commercial interest, and this activity is not commercially supported. So just to let you know, this series is ongoing, and we have 2 coming up on January 20th, and another 2 on January 27th. Right now you should be seeing in your chat box a link to go ahead and sign up for these if you'd like. The whole time we will be together today, you'll see links coming into your chat box if you feel like it is expedient for you to go ahead and sign up for things as we go along. So the topic next week, just quickly, identification of patients at risk for alcohol withdrawal by the use of prediction of alcohol withdrawal severity scale, lactate and lactate clearance to predict mortality in pediatric sepsis, a systematic review and diagnostic meta-analysis. I will move on. Okay, let's start with our first presentation today. Just to remind everybody that these presentations had won honorable mentions at our research day on December 4th, and we're extremely pleased to be able to bring you these sessions and highlight the work of these very, very good research projects. Our first one is the impact of a novel emergency department forward treatment area during the New York City COVID-19 surge. The PI facility was Jacobi, and the first author was Dr. Kaushal Khambhati, who will be presenting today. The observation of an emergency department forward treatment area during COVID-19. And here we go.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaushal Khambhati. I'm a EM PGY3 over at Jacobi. Wanted to talk to you about an observational piece that did with Joshua Moskowitz, one of our operations heads, and Jeremy Sperling, our department head, where we looked at the efficacy of our COVID-19 screening tents during our surge back in March and April of 2020. Looked at this data a little bit after, back in June, July. These are just some general COVID New York City stats, things that I think we all already know. So really the goal of our piece is really to just look at the efficacy of these tents that we set up outside of the ED. We set them up sort of to preserve normal ED operations. How do the folks who have appendicitis, who have MIs, who have strokes, still get the emergent care they need? And how do they stay safe and separate from COVID-19 PUIs? That was one of the problems that the tents serve to solve. And then the other being, how do we respond to a higher volume of the community who now want to come to the emergency room, know if they have COVID-19 or not, or if they need a higher level of care? So we set up 2 ventilated tents, operated for 11 hours a day. And anyone who walked into the ED, not came in by EMS, but walked in, had to come in had to be screened by these tents. Clerk opens up a patient visit, a PCA does vital signs, nurse does rapid triage, and then a mid-level does a complete H&P, presents to an emergency medicine attending, who is then responsible for dispositioning the patient either into the emergency room or home and educating them as appropriate. So we looked at the data from the folks who came through the tents over the course of 25 days. We looked at their vitals, saw who ended up being admitted, and who ended up unfortunately having a negative outcome, and who ended up having to come back after they were discharged. So to give credit where credit's due and sort of provide a little bit of background, alternate treatment areas are not new modalities. New Orleans and Dallas did a similar sort of thing during Hurricane Katrina, where folks from New Orleans were shipped over to Dallas, where they had repurposed buildings for almost fully functioning indoor emergency departments. A little more similar to what we did out here in New York City during COVID-19. During the H1N1 outbreaks in Houston, Texas Children's Hospital also set up tents, did rapid screening to determine who needed to go into the emergency department, who could be discharged, or who needed to go to urgent care immediately from the screening. This is a simplification of the patient flow that we had described. And then the sort of the meat of our statistics. So over the course of really 23 and a half days, we had to shut down the tent for a day and a half due to high winds, making them unsafe. 634 total patients. About 4/5 of them were discharged. About 1/5 of them were sent into the ED, and a little over 1/10 were admitted. Out of those who were discharged, a little over 10% ended up having to come back to the ED, and out of those, about 1/3 needed to be admitted. Average return time for those who ended up coming back was 6 days, and then the average return time for those who were eventually admitted was 3.5 days, so a little bit shorter. I think this makes sense. I think this is sort of in harmony with what we learned about disease progression in terms of who came back when. I wouldn't necessarily count them as failures of the screening exams. And then finally, some associations between age and vital signs in terms of who needed to be sent into the ED and then eventually admitted. Again, makes sense. Those who were tachycardic, tachypneic, hypoxic needed to be sent in and eventually admitted. Also, those who were older, more likely to be sent in and then admitted. One thing, and so, sort of to conclude, I think this was an effective screening tool. These tents, I think, were an effective screening modality to respond to higher volumes. And I think one of the most telling stats that we have is sort of out of all the bounce backs, there was one mortality. Unfortunately, one person who deceased on admission. But generally speaking, those who bounced back, either were discharged again or admitted and then eventually discharged. So I think these were effective, and I think if we see another surge as bad as we did in March or April, we can really refine these tents to be, quickly enactable solutions to rising volumes and regional or global pandemic. Just to sort of give a little bit more, this sort of laid the groundwork for another study that's going on across all of health and hospitals, where we look at a larger pool of data from the other tents that were set up by other H&H hospitals and we focus a little more on those who were discharged and how they ultimately ended up faring. So with that, thank you for your time. Happily take any questions. These are some of the references we used. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Khambhati. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions or type them into the chat box. While we're waiting, Dr. Khambhati, I have a question. The one mortality, were you able to look into that and see if that was something that could have been caught beforehand while he was still in the tent, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. No, so I went over that case myself as well, and the first discharge made sense. I think if I remember correctly, the patient ended up having a good amount of comorbidities, was admitted, and then and then the second time they came back, and then was intubated, and then went into cardiac arrest. I think it was just quick disease progression more than anything else, to be quite honest. It didn't really seem like there was like an obvious, we should have admitted this person the first time around sort of thing. I think that's a great question though. I think that those are like the cases that really like tell if this is, in a viable modality or not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else? Siomara, are there any questions in the chat room?
Not at the moment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, that was really great. Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Khambhati. We're going to go on to the next presentation, clinical findings post-hospital discharge in patients with COVID-19, a telephone interview study. The PI facility was Met Hospital. First author was Dr. Marlon Oliva, who will be presenting to us today. Take it away, Dr. Oliva.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marlon Oliva, one of the interns at New York Medical College Metropolitan Internal Medicine Program. I will be presenting a research about patients in whom we had a telephone visit post-COVID infection. Around December 2019, cases of coronavirus disease or COVID were reported across the world. Subsequently, on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic, which is considered the worst pandemic that we have encountered since the Spanish flu. In New York City, the first documented cases were reported in early March. As of January 2021, total of confirmed cases are over 420,000, resulting with over 70,000 hospitalizations, with approximately 20,000 confirmed deaths. During the inclusive date of our research, which is March to May 2020, New York City had an estimate of 150,000 survivors, with many of them still experiencing persistent symptoms following COVID-19 infection. During that period, we attended more than 500 patients with COVID-19 infections in our hospital. Therefore, we reached out to many of them to identify the post-discharge symptoms amongst adult patients who have been hospitalized and treated for COVID-19 from March to end of May 2020. All adult patients discharged from the hospital after admission for COVID-19 infection were contacted via telephone encounter as a post-discharge follow-up. A verbal consent to conduct a telephone follow-up was obtained from the patients as part of standard care. We created a standardized questionnaire, which was used during the telephone encounter to assess presence or absence of symptoms following discharge. Patients were also asked regarding repeat COVID-19 testing or viral antibody testing and its results. All responses during the telephone post-discharge follow-up were recorded in the electronic medical record. A multivariable logistic regression model was used to determine any association between the predictors and the outcomes of still being symptomatic versus having improved symptoms at follow-up date. Fifth, logistic regression was applied to the analysis in order to handle sample bias as well as low cell counts. Our study results show that 180 of the 337 patients who were discharged from COVID-19 infection had successful post-discharge telephone encounters, and 157 were unreachable. Our study identified 29 patients out of 180 who remained symptomatic after having been hospitalized for COVID-19 infection. The most commonly reported persistent signs and symptoms included fever, shortness of breath, and cough. After data analysis, an interesting finding was the statistical significance of association between history of hypothyroidism and persistence in symptoms. Based on our review of literature, there is no reported information regarding association of thyroid disease and a high risk of contracting COVID-19 infection, or its association with severe COVID infection. Another interesting aspect of this study was the majority of symptomatic patients with thyroid disease were male, though it is known that thyroid disease is more common in females than in males. Therefore, this observation should be further explored. Furthermore, we found that there's a high rate in persistence of symptoms in patients with benign prostatic hyperplasia. This may be explained by the correlation between high prevalence of 5-alpha reductase inhibitor in benign prostatic hyperplasia treatment and its potential negative influence on recovery after COVID-19 infection has been reported. Our study showed that patients with diabetes mellitus had less persistence of symptoms, which correlates with available reports showing that having diabetes mellitus did not make the COVID-19 outcome worse. In conclusion, the majority of patients discharged after hospitalizations for COVID-19 were asymptomatic at the time of follow-up, which ranged from day 9 to 92nd day, with an average of 57 days post-discharge. Fever, shortness of breath, and cough were the most common complaints of symptomatic patients. Our institution will continue to further follow the patients in our clinic to assess for long-term outcomes from this horrible disease. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, please feel free.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Oliva. We're opening it up for questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or type it into the chat room. While we're waiting, I have a question, Dr. Oliva. The people who didn't return your phone calls that you were not able to get a hold of, did you do any follow-up on them on whether they returned back to the hospital at any point, or came back in to see their physicians? Just curious about that group of people.
I'm sorry, I lost you there. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. Of the people that you weren't able to reach by telephone survey, Did you do any follow-up with them to see if they were, they came back to the hospital at a later time or had done any kind of follow-up for persistent symptoms? Even though you
That's a
not,
good question. They usually have follow-ups.
hello?
Hi, this is Jonah Mercado. I'm working with Dr. Oliva. I think he had a problem with his internet, but I can answer the questions because I'm the director of the medicine clinic and I'm his mentor. So
Great.
yes, so we made sure that first we tried to do a telephone encounter for all the patients regardless of their PCP. However, all these patients are also given their appointment to their PCP. And if they don't, we schedule them to our clinic. And if they don't follow up, we send them letters because again, they are unreachable by phone. So our typical process is that we give them 3 outreach letters.
Great, great, thank you. Any other questions? Any other questions for either of the speakers? Okay, well, we can wrap this up. Thank you for such an incredible program. Just a quick reminder, the New York Medical College is giving a half a credit for a CME. You can also sign in to get a CE for other CE credits that you might need. You will receive a certificate of participation. The sign-in methods are as below. Visit eeds.com. or text the code to 828-295-1144 and make sure to fill out the evaluation so you can get this credit. And we really appreciate all your attention today. And we look forward to seeing you next week. So please join us and have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.